Cuban Missile Crisis 2.0. It could happen again, but instead of Russians, China will be involved this time. Chinese military bases in Cuba worry the United States, of course, at a time when the crisis in China-U.S. relations is escalating after the new slip of U.S. President Joe Biden, who called the Chinese President Xi Jinping a dictator. A new source of tension appears in the foreground: the near destruction of the planet. When the Soviet Union placed its nuclear weapons in Cuba back in 1962, John F. Kennedy, as we know, was the president at that time, the United States threatened to attack unless the R-12 Dvina and R-14 Kusovaya missiles deployed on the Caribbean island nation were removed. After most of October of that year was spent in laborious talks and strategic military maneuvers that nearly escalated into full-scale confrontation just 17 years after World War II, Washington and Moscow finally negotiated a mutually beneficial, albeit at the final moment, an agreement that moved the world away from the thermonuclear abyss that threatened to destroy it, geopolitical and military analyst Drago Bosnik notes in his analysis. Chinese military bases in Cuba? For decades, much of the world was convinced that what is now unfairly called the Cuban Missile Crisis was started by Russia, and even today, when we all know it started with the U.S. in 1961 the deployment of nuclear-tipped PGM-19 Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy, Washington still insists that Moscow was responsible for the crisis. Something eerily similar is unfolding as we speak. However, instead of Russia, the other party involved in this case is now China. Specifically, according to the Wall Street Journal, Beijing is currently in talks with Havana on the creation of new military facilities in Cuba. The June 20th report, that's a day ago, said that the two socialist allies, of course, Cuba, as we know, is communist, so is China. The two communist allies are working out the financial arrangements of the deal that would reportedly secure a military base for the PLA, that's the People's Liberation Army, in northern Cuba. The Wall Street Journal reports that this has raised fears among U.S. officials that Cuba could eventually host a permanent Chinese troop presence, prompting the embattled Biden administration to intervene with Cuban officials seeking to block the establishment of permanent military installations. This also reportedly includes expanding the ISR, that's intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, capabilities of the PLA's existing military establishment. The claims about alleged Chinese military bases in Cuba are based on unnamed sources from unnamed U.S. intelligence agencies. However, the authors admit that the aforementioned agencies are not exactly sure about the possibilities of the comprehensive China-Cuba joint military base, noting that, quote, reference to the proposed new training facility in Cuba is contained in the top-secret new U.S. information, which state officials' department called convincing but fragmentary, end quote. The publication also adds that it is interpreted with varying levels of concern among policymakers and intelligence analysts. Now, what is worrying the United States about all this? Most concerns for the U.S., the planned installation is part of China's 141 plan, that's 141 plan, an initiative by the People's Liberation Army to expand its global military base and logistics network all over the world, a current and former U.S. official said. China and Cuba already jointly operate 4 listening stations on the island, according to U.S. officials. That network underwent a major upgrade around 2019 when a single station expanded into a network of 4 stations operating jointly, and Chinese involvement deepened, according to officials. The Wall Street Journal editors elaborate. It's hard enough to gauge the sheer magnitude of Washington's hypocrisy and double standards when it comes to this issue, given not only the clearly hostile and often openly xenophobic rhetoric, but also the numerous concrete moves aimed at China. Could one honestly accuse Beijing of anything other than reciprocity? In addition to the trade war launched under former President Donald Trump, the U.S. is waging an all-out creeping aggression against China, openly seeking to contain the Asian giant with a vast network of military bases and other facilities across the Asia-Pacific region. China and Taiwan. Most worrying for Beijing is that the U.S. is seeking to push its military infrastructure closer and closer to the owners of China, particularly by exerting greater control over the Asian giant's breakaway island province of Taiwan. And this is only the tip of the iceberg of the resurgent neo-McCarthyism in American foreign policy, which includes sending entire delegations of Washington's warships to Taipei, Taiwan, in addition to massive shipments of arms and equipment, which now include F-16 Block 70, 72 fighter jets and hundreds of anti-ship missiles worth around $20 billion, though mostly delayed due to U.S. over-focus of the Kiev regime. Given such unadulterated hostility, can one blame Beijing for wanting to strengthen its ties with Havana, Cuba? Even worse, Cuba is an independent country, while Taiwan is internationally recognized as part of China anyway, including the U.S. itself, which means that the expansion of U.S. military infrastructure on the island directly threatens Chinese sovereignty and territorial integrity. However, in its endless hypocrisy and double standards, Washington wants to preserve the Monroe Doctrine by putting additional pressure on Latin America while invading the geopolitical backyards of other superpowers. Some intelligence officials say Beijing sees its actions in Cuba as a geographic response to the U.S. relationships in Taiwan. The U.S. invests heavily in equipping and training the self-ruled island off mainland China, and the which Beijing claims is its own. The Wall Street Journal admitted with suspicion, adding, "The paper reported that the U.S. has deployed more than 100 troops to Taiwan to train its defense forces." This is from Banking News Greece, and I've translated this for you from a Greek article. Please leave your comments, and thank you for your support. Please support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.